Hello, everyone. Welcome to Optimized for Humans, a podcast where we explore the role of AI within organizations and how we make the most of humans and AI within the workplace. Today, my name is Usha. I'm an executive coach and consultant. Today, I'm speaking with Adam Luebbers, who's an AI transformation, operations, and customer experience executive, and he's had experience across organizations like Clear, Rivian, Amazon, GM, and Apple. Adam, welcome to this podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you. I'm excited. Looking forward to the conversation.
So, you've led quite a bit of enterprise transformations within organizations, and I'm really curious to hear. You've also worked with AI, specifically in enterprise AI adoption, and I'm really curious to hear what camps are you noticing people fall into in this kind of AI adoption space?
Yeah, that it's a great question. And while um, obviously there's going to be outliers here. I'm kind of observing right now three very distinct patterns across organizations as it comes to enterprise AI adoption. Um, And the three categories have evolved over time, but the first one is definitely the one that you're hearing the most about, where AI adoption is primarily being driven by the need for efficiency. So view it as a cost reduction opportunity. And so that's camp number one, where the overarching goal is really around being a pure efficiency play.
Mm,
The second camp that you're seeing is really those that are focused not just on the implementation of the tool, but the risks that may be associated with it. And those risks can really fall into a couple of different categories. So obviously there's regulatory risk. There's a human connection and trust risk. There's an internal stakeholder and external stakeholder trust risk. So depending upon the industry you're in, there are those that are heavily focused on that. And then that is really manifesting in um, maybe a failure to start, really heavily invested in the pre conversations around AI enterprise implementation. And then the third are really those that are making real progress by understanding that fundamentally enterprise AI adoption is not a technology implementation. So those organizations that are viewing AI implementation as just a technology implementation, they are really struggling with adoption rates, and they're struggling with overall return on investment. And so that's kind of a trend
mm.
that we're seeing across the industry. Those that are succeeding are really viewing it as a fundamental operating model transformation. So those that are taking the opportunity to look at end-to-end org design, end-to-end process design, to really understand and review, not only from a customer perspective, whether that be an internal customer or an external customer, really taking the opportunity to say, let's stop for a moment and really redesign so that we're fully getting the benefits of a true AI implementation.
Yeah, and interesting. What's coming up for me in that is a conversation that I've had with a few others around this, which is this partnership between the AI and really thinking of AI as a member of the team. I think this was something actually
Mhm.
we had spoken about, and really
Yeah.
thinking of reimagining the operating model to integrate this whole other kind of member of the organization in its own right. And I'm curious to hear more about some of the like on the ground, what have you seen work well in that kind
Mhm.
of operating model redesign? And where are the challenges or like holes that we need to be mindful of?
Yeah, I think, broadly speaking, across industries, it really boils down to a difference between, and I want to pause and say that this is a common misperception. That what I'm first going to say is that there's often, whether it's from a leadership standpoint or just across industries, that the difference between success and really struggle is the difference between optimism versus skepticism of AI. And I am not seeing that be the case at all. Really, what it boils down to is whether the organization, whether it be leadership or those that are implementing across the enterprise, recognize that successful AI adoption requires the rethinking of roles, incentives, governance, and even decision making structures. Because the one thing that AI is really good at when implemented successfully is increasing the number of signals that you are getting. But in and of itself, it's not going to fix the decision making structures. And so, one of the things that companies are having to do and having to think about is, do our traditional decision making structures still make sense? And that's obviously going to vary company to company and industry to industry, but it has to be part of the process. So, when you're taking on an enterprise level AI adoption, again, it's not thinking of this as I'm just implementing a new tool, but it's taking the opportunity to review organizational structures, governments, incentives, or the incentives that previously made sense for organizations, are they actually at odds with what you are implementing, and will they slow down the transfer of information to the right decision making structures in this new world with AI?
Yeah, I was smiling a bit as when you were saying decision making, because I think that's really at the crux of a lot of things. And I think the way that we've traditionally designed organizations really slows us down. It works for a world who's that that had a pace that just we were nowhere near the pace that it was actually designed for, where we have this like hierarchy where things have to go up in order to come down, and there's a lot of bottlenecks that we experience, et cetera. And there's something about how do we reimagine that in order to actually pick up on the signals that are coming through, because we now have access to more data and more knowledge, and how do we empower the entire organization to be that kind of sensor that's picking up on the signals and escalating the right ones? And how do we reimagine decision making? Like, what would you advise?
Yeah, so those are excellent questions. Like, if we're talking specifically about, let's start first with like authority and decisions. Authority design needs to be reevaluated to ensure that the decisions rights exist where cross-functional problems actually live. And where they live today, pre-AI implementation, is not a guarantee that that's where they're going to live post-AI implementation. And so, really ensuring that those who are making the decisions, we question to say, does this still make sense in the new world of the AI implementation? And quickly behind that is incentive alignment. I've talked about it a little bit previously, but you need to be rewarding system-wide outcomes, enterprise-wide outcomes, versus just functional efficiency. And so, what may have traditionally worked in a previous organization as it relates to incentives might not be the right incentive going forward. And it might still be this right incentive, but the organizations that are succeeding are those that take the opportunity to ensure that the incentives still align. Another area that I talk about heavily is governance. Um, Pre AI, not an exciting topic to cover, but has become that much more crucial, especially with enterprise wide transformation. Governance structures in the world of AI should make sure that learning changes processes, not just creates documentation. So, um, governance in and of itself, and AI, and even pre-AI, there were a lot across organizations, and across industries, a lot of dashboards, a lot of ways to create documentation, but that is not helpful to anyone. Just the act of creating the documentation, creating a postmortem, doesn't help anyone. It's really making sure that learning changes processes. So, using a postmortem example, which is very industry standard, um, what was the outcome of that? Did everyone read a document and say, okay, we're not going to do that again? Or are we leveraging the new signals to really make sure that we're changing the processes, and that, again, we're not creating documentation? And then finally, to the last point that you mentioned, really around signal architecture. So one of the best things that I've talked about that AI is great at is it can bring you a ton of signals, which is really exciting in and of itself. But you have to create clear paths for those insights to reach decision makers with the proper context. So if your AI implementation just results in new dashboards, it's not going to succeed, or it's going to struggle to succeed. So in addition to those dashboards, which you absolutely should have dashboards, it's really creating clear paths for insights to reach those new decision makers after you've reviewed the organizational structure, to ensure that they're getting it in a timely manner and with the proper context. The last thing I'll say there is that anyone can make data tell any story they want it to tell. And so the most important thing is really the context around it.
There's so much in that, and what I really appreciate is, like, the nuance that you're pointing to in terms of what an operating model actually is. I think in so
Mhm.
many ways, we focus on structure and hierarchy, and you see this often in terms of, restructures and org change. A lot of those sort of change and transformation efforts are really just focusing on structure, moving people around, but there's actually all of these different layers to it. And one of the things that I think is going to be really important with that is actually an opportunity that AI is speeding up is shifting from these kind of rigid top-down hierarchies into more of a
Mhm.
network. There is still a hierarchy within that network, but that there's more players, there's more fluidity, there's more decision-making authority is deliberately distributed across the organization. And that alignment from the top, the strategic alignment from the top is still really clean and
Mhm.
clear. And I think that's a really important and a challenging thing to accomplish within organizations, especially when we're moving from quite rigid hierarchies and a whole lot of politics that are kind of embedded within that. But I think that network distributed way of working is actually where we have the most where we can have more ideas come up to the front, where we can have more innovation and a whole lot of opportunity, I think, lies within that. And part of that is that governance and distributing authority. And to me, when I think of governance, it's really just making clear what are we trying to achieve? Who gets to
Mhm.
make what decisions? What are the roles and accountabilities here? And what are all the player and really like establishing that for cross-functional teams and establishing that across the mission that we're trying to achieve rather than the functional team that we belong to. And to be doing that in a continuous way and in a participatory way where we get to learn together and change the governance and change the way we work continually. So there's
Right.
lots of really exciting opportunities here, I think. And also, like having implemented some of these transformations, it's a real culture change. It's a really difficult shift.
It absolutely can be, if it is not handled appropriately.
Right.
And really that boils down to obviously a couple of different things, but it boils down to trust as well, and trust internally and externally. So at the end of the day, we have internal customers and we have who are employees and cross-functional partners, and we have an external customers, who may be end users, they could be
Yeah.
businesses, and so change, so many adages about this, but obviously change can be difficult. But when AI implementation, especially enterprise AI implementation, fails, it's almost never a technology failure. It's not the actual underlying technology. It's an execution failure. Um, and so we unfortunately are seeing across industries, we're seeing a lot of examples of that right now where pilots are failing to succeed. Excuse me, pilots do succeed, but then they really fail to scale, because the legacy workflows were not reviewed and changed, or the insights are generated, but the escalation paths don't reach the right decision makers, as we talked about. And then finally, the last big one is if you embark on an enterprise AI implementation plan, um, are all of your metrics identical to what they were previously? If they are, I would potentially be concerned. If we are asking organizations to operate differently, then by definition, some of the metrics should be changing. And so if all of the old metrics and the old incentives are still being enforced, um, it's really going to prevent you from having long-term success, even if you did have some initial success with a pilot. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of richness there in all of that. I want to shift gears a little bit, and you mentioned, you alluded to this around this notion of like customer experience, and I'd love
Mhm.
to learn more from you around what have you seen work really well in terms of AI adoption in the customer experience space, and what would you advise and caution leaders as they're thinking about integrating AI within the customer experience space. And I'll caveat that as that seems to be something that a lot of leaders are really paying attention to from that efficiency gains perspective that you mentioned.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a timely question, and so I answer this when working and looking across industries, the trends that I'm seeing right now. I really start to answer this by posing a question, which is, um, the more strategic question right now isn't what can AI do versus what can humans do. It's how do I implement an enterprise-wide system that allows me to architect a system where each operates at their highest value. And that, if you go in with that fundamental way of framing, it allows you to more expertly and successfully integrate AI. AI is exceptionally exceptional at handling multitude of intents, and it handles what scales: pattern detection, high volume execution, 24/7 availability, defect prevention. All of these things AI excels at. Um, Humans excel at what compounds. So complex judgment, relationship building, creative problem solving, and trust creation. Those are the areas that currently humans really excel at. And it's not that they won't be the only thing that excels at that, but right now, that fundamental difference of, instead of this being a framing of what can I get AI to do to replace a human, it really should be, as you're looking at your end-to-end processes and your organizational design and your implementation strategy, how do I design a system that allows both to perform where they truly provide the most value? And in doing so, allow that value to continue to scale over time. Um, and so, as we talked about earlier, this really all revolves around an operating model redesign. um, Organizations that try to just overlay AI on existing workflows struggle. And they're going to continue to struggle. Successful adoption requires, again, rethinking of roles, processes, metrics, and governance, not just the deploying of a new technology and hoping to get a high adoption rate. When properly architected, and this is the good news, when done so correctly, this not only becomes a huge driver of customer satisfaction, but it can become a huge driver for revenue. And so, another way that I talk about this between humans versus AI is that this is not just an efficiency play. And I know at the top of the podcast I talked about that. There's so much more that's limiting it, is the reason I talk about that. Yes, of course, there can be some cost savings initially, but that is so much smaller, a much smaller way to think about it. There's a huge revenue driver potential to this, depending upon your industry. And so, yeah, hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, I do think there this is another mindset shift here. I love the first mindset shift that you're really pointing to, which is like stop thinking about what can AI do that I can replace the humans with, and start thinking about where are both players best positioned and how can you get
Mhm.
the most out of their kind of unique expertise. And then the second mindset shift that I'm really hearing from you is, are we optimizing for growth or are we optimizing for cost savings? And
Mhm.
actually, those are two different plays. And of course, it's not an either or. There's a place, to do both. But I do think there is um, a bit of haste that is moving in the direction of the efficiency play, and we're missing some
Mhm.
of the bigger, broader opportunities here. Um, I'd love to kind of ground this in an example, just as a thought experiment, if you're up for
Mhm.
it. Let's say I
Sure.
I am running a company. I'm the CEO of this company that does fiber water. Most millennials don't seem to be eating enough fiber. It's a real issue. So we created this company. It's going really well. We're scaling, and we have a team of 100 people who just
Mhm.
take calls and answer customer inquiries
Mhm.
around our fiber water. You'd be surprised how many people have questions about our fiber water. And the board has instructed me to leverage AI to make things faster, make things cheaper, go. And I
Mhm.
come to you and I say, help. What would
Yeah.
you advise?
Yeah. So, the first thing I always say in this situation is, what a wonderful problem to solve. But we need to pump the brakes ever so slightly to review, like, what is our end-to-end journey right now? What are our customers really enjoying? Um, and from that, and the reason I start there is that AI excels in general customer education questions. It's available 24/7. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't have bad days, doesn't need to take a break. And so what we want to do is, very quickly as we're implementing AI, we want to focus on those particular areas, not to I forget the number of individuals you say, but
100.
the motivation there is not to say, okay, we've implemented this brand new system that's reduced, taken X percentage of our customer education calls off of this team. Now let's just reduce the size of that team. That is very short sighted thinking, definitely in the short term. What you first need to do is say, all right, so we're a growing business. We want to 10x, 100x this business. Are there ways to upskill that organization? They already have wonderful, ability to speak to customers. Would it be better to focus that organization on outbound revenue driving opportunities? So for the customers that you already have, could they work on retention, which is a huge area of opportunity in customer experience and customer service? And quite frankly, it's an area that organizations have not been able to focus on as much as they'd want to, just due to the nature of the business and the amount of inbound volume. So, what I would first do for this organization, again, is take a moment to understand, what is your end to end journey? What is it that the customers are already seeing great success with? If that is a very low lift interaction, copy it. So, if you a salesperson, or a customer service agent who's really great at helping with questions about the type of fiber that's in this water, um, that's low hanging fruit. Let's definitely automate that through AI and provide a really great experience. But as I've kind of alluded to earlier, trust is still a huge component of this. And so, um, there is resistance to interaction with AI depending upon the topic that's being covered. And so, really understanding what are the topics that have low risk initially, and really targeting that, but at the same time, really reviewing the end-to-end experience and what that organization fundamentally is chartered to do, and evolving that in the new age where you have this wonderful AI implementation that's helping take whatever percentage of your frontline contacts off. And so that way, you're not just getting the efficiency play, but you're actually taking that efficiency and using it as an opportunity to grow the overall business, which is a really great way to think about an AI implementation if it's starting from an enterprise level at more of the customer facing teams.
I really love that. I love that kind of push to kind of reimagine what's possible and really like upskill people accordingly. Also with this fiber water kind of example, I don't know how many like what emotional states we'll be tapping into in terms of customers because it's a bit of a more straightforward business. But I'm imagining something like something health related, or even I
Hmm.
remember calling my credit card company a few months ago in a pretty emotional state because there was a broader context that was like really distressing. And I just remember the other person and their kindness in helping me work through
Hmm.
that. And it had nothing to do with the thing at hand. It wasn't about like whatever the charge was and what have you, but it was just somebody on the other end who I could really trust, who would understand the nuance of my situation because it wasn't straightforward and was
Hmm.
able to just kind of help stay and be like calm me down in some ways,
Mhm.
by being present, by being empathetic, by staying connected. And I think, especially for industries where, you are likely to have customers come in across a myriad of different emotional states, I think that's really, the trust thing really matters. Like, I hate talking to chatbots most of the time. I'm always like, get me to the customer representative as soon as possible. Like, I hate the ones where like press nine, press one, press three.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people share that experience. I also know there are people who would rather talk to a bot than a human and
Mhm.
just hate phone calls. But part of, I think, the imperative for leaders is like, how can you cater to all of these different needs and emotional states in a strategic way? And
Yeah.
AI won't be able to cater across the spectrum.
Yeah, it's the use cases you mentioned there are obviously very common, and you hear them all the time. And the way I think about them is immediately, why is there distrust? And the answer is really, and this is the good news, is there's a very simple answer to this, and it's around trust. And the good news is that there's a system and a flow to follow around this, but trust is built through reliability and transparency. And the good news is both of those things come back to the way the system itself is designed. And so there's really the opportunity to implement a resilience framework, which I talk about in my work a lot, where systems that are doing this correctly anticipate issues before the customer experiences them. And the organizations that are implementing a resilience framework adapt quickly when things go wrong. That's a hallmark of an organization that is fully mature on a resiliency framework. And teams that learn from every interaction systemically. This is something that AI obviously does inherently well. And so it definitely has that. And improvements get reinforced into operations so that they stick. And so when I hear individuals have had a bad experience with chatbots, I always like to dig a little bit deeper into that, like what caused that bad experience. And when they describe it, it is a bad experience. And it's because um, the bot could have been pre AI, so it might have been a tree logic based bot, or it could have been an
Mm.
early implementation of it. But is it learning in real time? Is it recognizing the tone of the situation and what the customers are saying? But to your point, there are absolutely groups who, if they know it's AI, they ask for a human, and those who have the opportunity to not talk to a human will always take that option. And so it's a really interesting time across industries. It's a really exciting time where we're seeing all of the frontline teams, whether it's customer service or customer experience or revenue generation or success teams that are really evolving from reactive organizations. Success obviously was never meant to be reactive, but in many cases is, into proactive value drivers. And so, kind of the area of AI implementation that's not talked about enough across industries is really the retention play. AI, when implemented correctly alongside your existing organizations that are restructured, can have a dramatic impact on your retention strategy. And so, I talked about it earlier, but that is when, I'm talking to companies or seeing patterns across industries, that is an area that companies need to hone in on. It's we like to start first with customer facing teams, but it's so much larger than that. And so again, not to repeat myself, but the organizations that are succeeding with this are treating it as a strategic transformation versus an operational improvement.
Mm. So, Adam, what would your advice be for leaders who are really wanting to step into that kind of strategic transformation? And what are you noticing in terms of the existing mindsets, around leadership tables? And what would you advise them to move towards?
Yeah, a lot of it is what we've talked about already. The secret sauce is following systems and frameworks that allow you to implement this successfully. The conversations right now are definitely evolving at a very, very fast pace. we're past the points of pilots as it comes to AI. There's a lot of conversations and a lot of articles about those that have been successful versus those that haven't. And also, transparently, how far organizations are along on the journey of implementing AI. There's a huge gamut, and for some organizations, it's going to be more complex. Whether it's speaking about a tech stack implementation just being more complex, or just the size of the organization. But how I would frame that conversation again, if I was speaking to a leader at any company, would be you have to view this from an organizational structure standpoint, an end-to-end process standpoint, and really view this as an overall strategic implementation. And kind of an example of that, in plain speak, would be if you were viewing this and you're thinking of whatever process you're currently thinking of. Let's say it's taking a customer service call, and the way you're viewing this is, how do I get AI to replace that? That is not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is from the end-to-end experience of, why is the call taking place? Why are they speaking to us? Is there a way to implement, self-service automation? And then the last line of defense really being that human support, which is still entirely necessary. I always like to say that when implemented successfully, AI turns your agents into superhumans. And so it is a daunting task for sure. However, there are examples of this, succeeding across industries. But the first advice I give is really around, you need to review end-to-end processes to understand how can AI make our processes better and more efficient.
Yeah, what I really hear in that is a shift from kind of this like cost saving or even just a little bit of like scarcity driven, like we're missing out, we have to get on this train now, figure
Mhm.
it out, to actually like what's the impact we want to have. So it's really stepping all the way back and thinking through what do we want to create? What do we want the experience of our organization to be in this world with our customers, and starting there with really thinking through from an end-to-end perspective rather than I think the kind of more cost saving mindset, which I just want to be clear, I'm not knocking that. I think there's a lot of like richness in that, but I think there's a much bigger opportunity here to think and reimagine impact and purpose and people and kind of start there rather than a, plug and play, take these people out, put this bot in. I think there's just more.
100%. There's absolutely nothing wrong with cost efficiency.
Yeah.
Everyone should be doing that. What I am saying merely on this from a framework point of view, which I think you did a good job of saying, is that that's so much smaller than it could be. It's a missed opportunity to just stop there, to say
Yeah.
that it's an efficiency point, because there is so much more. And going back to your last question, talking to leaders, if I were to frame this in terms of behaviors across industries, the framework that I share is the behaviors that are creating risk right now with AI implementation are really those that are racing to deploy without established governance frameworks. Those that, as we talked about, are optimizing purely for efficiency, while trust and adoption continue to suffer because they weren't a focus of it. Um, as I talked, not to repeat, but maintaining legacy incentive structures while expecting new behaviors doesn't make sense. And then treating AI as just a technology or an IT project rather than an enterprise transformation. And that one is a big trend that we're definitely seeing. This is not just an IT project. This is not just a technology project. This is not just an engineering project. It's not an operations project. It's not a marketing project. It is a complete enterprise transformation, and it needs to be treated as such. And then finally, the biggest behavior that's creating risk is really um, generating signal without redesigning how it's escalated through that organization. Um, Whereas on the flip side, the behaviors that do drive results are, as we've talked about, redesigning where authority and accountability live inside the organization, building governance that enforces learning, not just documents it, aligning cross-functional incentives to system-wide or enterprise-wide outcomes, and then architecting insights that reach decision makers with the right context and authority to act. There's nothing more frustrating than building a dashboard, giving the right context, and then it's reached someone who does not have the authority to act on it. And so that is definitely going to drive results if they do have the authority, and it's not going to drive results if they don't. And then finally, um, the overarching theme here of starting with an operating model design, then choosing the technology. And that is really key. And so the impact to that, leaders who are rushing to create organizational risk and compliance gaps, it can erode trust. It can stall adoption. Like, these are all real risks that can happen. But those who redesign thoughtfully around a full enterprise system way of thinking can build a sustainable competitive advantage through faster adoption and better execution.
Thank you so much, Adam, for bringing such nuance into this conversation. I'm excited for people to listen in on this, and I'm excited for people to start really reckoning with how much more complex this actually is, and to have some of the tools and a more concrete starting place to actually dive into that. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me today.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.